Okay, good afternoon again, everyone. I know some people will have had to leave to go and do school pickups, but the good news is for those of you who are left, this is the bit where we get some really good interaction going because we need to wake everyone up. And I've been clearly instructed by Dan that I must finish by around 5:15 because we'll have a wrap up, and I would not want to prevent anyone getting home to see their children or indeed going to the pub after 5:30. So we are here to talk about DNFBPs. I'm going to come and take a seat with the panel, but just briefly to do some introductions. Now, Noémi has already been introduced to us from her fantastic talk before on proliferation financing. So I'm just going to go through. So I'm sure Ashley Whyte will be no stranger to anyone. Ashley is head of AML CFT supervision at the FSA and leads the division that's responsible for supervising all financial institutions and DNFBPs. The division's also responsible for supervision in relation to beneficial ownership and AML CFT policy matters, such as the code and associated guidance. Ashley's been involved with the previous Moneyval assessment in the island in 2016 and is heavily involved in leading preparations for the next evaluation. Welcome, Ashley. Coming on to Rachael at the end of the panel, Rachael McGeachie is Head of Compliance and Risk at Trident Trust in the Isle of Man and is responsible for the regulatory compliance and is MLRO for the TCSP. Rachel's also on the ACSP board and a member of the TCSP Financial Crime Partnership. And last but not least, Lesley Webb is a practicing advocate, managing partner and compliance director at Callan Wild LLC and is responsible for oversight of regulatory compliance for both Callan Wild LLC and CW Corporate Services Limited. So we have a group of both public and private sector here to discuss DNFBP risks today. Now, I'm also going to ask you to log on to Slido because we are going to try a technology word cloud during this. It could go horribly wrong. I will announce the question halfway through this, but they can be quite fun if they work and sometimes quite amusing. You will also be able to load Slido questions by clicking on the separate tab. So if you've got burning questions, please pop them in as well. So after that introduction, Noémi, I'd like to turn to you first. So you are an expert on risk and the author of Deconstructing Money Laundering Risk, De-risking, the risk-based approach and risk communication. Can you tell us from your perspective the importance of applying risk mitigation measures at sectoral levels, so to DNFBPs rather than generally?
It's quite a long title. I do apologize for that.
It's a complicated topic.
Yeah. True. So I think I'd like to go back to the panel you were on this morning, and Shannon really talked about this. You really highlighted this, right? Which was the importance of building up our understanding of risk. So starting at the bottom and building this up, and then using this understanding at a more granular level. Quote, to really drive the strategy, to drive the ML, TF, and PF strategy forward. I think it's absolutely fundamental. In the context, of course, of immediate outcome 4, we know that it is now very important that DNFBPs have a better understanding, a more granular understanding of what the risks are. So I think, obviously, coming back to the sectoral aspect is key. And it's particularly important because we know that the DNFBP sector is incredibly heterogeneous. And I think based on my experience, and I'm not talking here for the Isle of Man, I'm talking about other jurisdictions, there is an element of educating the supervisor because some of the supervisors in some jurisdictions are still very immature. So I was very interested, again, I'm referring to you, Nikesh, I'm so sorry, I keep on pointing you, but what you're talking about today around the arts and antiques market, that is something that I've seen in another jurisdiction where really you have a completely disconnected antiques market on the private side, and then the supervisor really don't know how to go about it. So I think having the sectoral risk assessment is actually very important. And also, I think it enables DNFBPs to set the narrative, to almost engage in advocacy work. So that's basically my response.
And I entirely agree. When you think of the differences between the varied types of DNFBPs that countries have, now here in the Isle of Man, we're a little bit more restricted with predominantly lawyers, TCSPs, accountants, auditors, etc. The risks that can be prevalent for different sectors are very different, and the supervisor is learning about those risks at the same time as the industry, which nicely brings us on to Ashley, if that's okay. So Ashley, given the profile of those different DNFBPs in the Isle of Man, the authority obviously agency needs to balance its resource quite carefully on a risk-based approach when it comes for DNFBP supervision. Can you talk us through those unique challenges that DNFBPs face when implementing AML controls and how they're manifesting here?
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, George. So I think it might be useful I did find the mic. I think it might be useful just to do a little bit of a scene setting of how we do supervise in the Isle of Man for designated businesses. So the Financial Services Authority, we supervise all financial institutions and most designated businesses for AML-CFT. Our colleagues at the Gambling Supervision Commission look after gaming. The other thing I do want to mention is that we can actually delegate our supervision as well. So if there's an appropriate professional body, we can delegate supervision to that body, although the FSA does retain responsibility. So how that would work is the professional body could do the supervision on our behalf, but if there was any further work needed, that would come back to the authority to deal with. Even where we do delegate, so we delegate some of the accountancy bodies, the Isle of Man Law Society, we do still have touch points with all of our designated businesses through the data collection that we do annually. And also we could still involve some of those designated businesses in one of our thematic exercises if we wanted full coverage of a sector. And if there was any kind of potential further supervisory action or something more in depth, that would need to come back to us, such as some sort of enforcement action as well. And we do quality assurance work with the bodies that we do delegate to as well. That's a really important part of that. I think one of the challenges is really the breadth of the designated businesses that we have here, which has been mentioned today as well. So, for instance, in our sector here, we have, small accountancy firms, 1 sort of 2 people, right up to the accountancy big fours. We have law practices, estate agents, money lenders. We also include virtual asset service providers in our designated business sector. In the Isle of Man, our TCSPs, they're actually fully regulated, but in the FATF standards, they are classed as a designated business. For the purposes of the panel today, we are sort of including TCSPs in our discussion. And when it comes to our mutual evaluation, the TCSPs will be treated as designated businesses under the relevant immediate outcome. I was going to just talk a little bit about the risk-based approach as well. So we have a real breadth of businesses on the island, breadth of sectors, not just in the designated business world, but in the financial institutions world as well. And a challenge can be that actually all of these businesses use the same AML-CFT code. So we have one code that really has to apply to about 20 different sectors. And that can be quite challenging. And that's where really good guidance is important, so that we can do guidance that sits alongside the AML-CFT code that brings out the nuances in those different sectors as well. And a key point I wanted to bring out from the code as well is it does allow for a risk-based approach. And as per the international standards, it's encouraged to take a risk-based approach, provided that it's assessed properly, the risks are considered, documented, any risks that are identified inform the procedures and the controls of the business. So in terms of challenges from the supervisor's perspective, I think the breadth of the industry is definitely challenging because we're obviously looking at completely different businesses when we go and do our supervision. I think it can be challenging for businesses as well, because I mentioned some of the different sizes of businesses, but the sizes, the complexity, different businesses are going to have different resources, which means that they can, that's going to really impact the controls framework they can have in place as well. So I do think there's some challenges from that respect. In terms of the risk-based approach, I would say that we're very pragmatic as a supervisor, and we look at the different sectors that we've got. We look at the different risk ratings, and we use the risk ratings that we develop using the data that is submitted. And I have to thank everybody again for the data that we get, because that really does make sure that we can implement a risk-based approach and we can apply our resources in the right place. But also from a business perspective, making sure that you are getting the right level of supervision as well. So I think that's probably some of the key challenges, really, are some of the differences.
And just to kind of reflect on that, do you think that getting that balance right is a challenge for the supervisor as well for the industry? Because I think from my perspective around the world, with DNFBPs given that variation, the supervisor needs to be consistently open to changing the way they do things. Is that a fair way of putting that?
Yeah, I'd say so. I'd say we're trying to be quite reactive to that. As a supervisor, we're always looking to the international standards, the FATF guidance documents that come out, looking at all the different sectors as well. I think we'll probably come on to the national risk assessment a little bit later, but that's another tool where we are looking at and recognising some of those differences in the sectors.
I think that's absolutely right. And then the other thing I think with this area is that DNFBPs, the variation means that every supervisor in the world who supervises such a varied sector is constantly evolving. So the Isle of Man is no different there. Now, Rachel, I'd like to come to you now to talk about it from the other side of the fence, from the TCSP side. How is the TCSP industry adapting to change in the risk profile of the Isle of Man over the years? And what are the current challenges with risk understanding and risk management in your sector?
Sure. So I think, with all of the industries within the Isle of Man financial services sector, the TCSP sector in itself is seeing lots of change, risks of evolving all of the time. In my experience, I would say the main challenge we've seen over the last certainly couple of years is a change in profile of our actual clients. Who is it that's coming and seeking out our services? We're well established, and we've built our control frameworks in line with the regulations and the code that we have, geared towards what's our bread and butter client, if you like, and that would be, our ultra high net worth individual who's, from family generational wealth, maybe attached to listed businesses or well-known brands, and they're coming to the Isle of Man to set up an offshore structure because of maybe estate planning, or they want to operate, part of that business from the island. And with that kind of client, we were in a relatively comfortable place to be able to meet our own regulatory requirements by knowing what kind of source of wealth, source of funds documentation we needed, and what we could obtain quite easily, bank statements, investment portfolio statements that had a good name and address on, that was attached to a human being that was our underlying client. But with that change of profile of client that we're seeing now, it's maybe not having that kind of documentation available to us anymore. But our control frameworks are still the same as they have been built around the regulations that we're in. So maybe we're looking at more new money, people who have amassed wealth a lot quicker, maybe in more tech-driven businesses, e-commerce, more online-based businesses, and then moving into virtual assets and cryptocurrency. So whilst we might be comfortable looking at pounds and sterling that sat in a high street bank, we're now being faced with looking at a crypto wallet, and is that an exchange? Decentralized wealth, more transient wealth, and like I say, it hasn't necessarily got that human factor attached to it. It's a series of digits. So as an industry, we're having to educate ourselves and seek out resources to be able to understand how to assess that kind of due diligence, to be able to onboard those types of clients. And then I think beyond onboarding, actually looking at the underlying activity of the types of clients that we're providing services for, and they might be clients that fit into designated business, more tech-based businesses, maybe VASPs, etc. As an established, industry of TCSPs, and we've got highly skilled and highly qualified staff members, team members that have done STEP, ICA, accountants, etc. Are they still fit for purpose to be able to manage and provide ongoing services to that sort of client? Can we discharge our fiduciary duties But on the wider point, to protect ourselves and our firms and the Isle of Man, identify what might be unusual activity or beyond that, and to remain competitive and be able to win and retain that type of business as well. So I think for me, with my TCSP hat on, I think there's a real challenge for us to continue to adapt whilst looking after our traditional bread and butter clients, but look at this kind of new age profile as well.
Absolutely. And it's showing that evolution on the private sector side is required. As usual, the market is moving faster than our traditional frameworks on both sides provide for. So this is definitely a challenge that I think is being faced worldwide, but TCSPs can deal with so many underlying different businesses that this is where it becomes a particular challenge. But passing to the legal sector, Lesley, are the legal sector facing similar challenges, or are they slightly different or nuanced in any way?
I'd say broadly we're facing the same challenges as Rachael has already highlighted. I think when you look at more traditional models of law firms that we're used to dealing with in the Isle of Man, potentially, speaking from one of them, it's probably even slower moving when it comes to us. Anybody who's spoken to me over the last couple of years will have definitely heard me rail against the typologies that we're constantly battling in terms of even residential conveyancing. So my firm deals a lot with residential conveyancing, and I would have been the person that says the typology is wrong. We are not dealing with these people. We know all of our clients. They're all local. It's all face-to-face business over and over and over again. I remember it clearly on the last risk assessment saying it. I've said it again. And now I'm having to eat my own words, so to speak, because I've seen a dramatic shift in our client base and the people looking to relocate to the Isle of Man, which is absolutely brilliant for Isle of Man PLC. But it's giving us challenges that we possibly haven't faced before. And I feel, are having to react quite quickly. One of the main challenges is the speed at which everything has to move now. We used to have, months to think about these things. Now everybody wants everything done within 48 hours. It's the pressure. And I can see where the cracks would potentially begin to show if you are not adequately resourced. It's fine when you have a team, you have a compliance team, they're experienced. We have an accounts team that sit behind them. We're all very experienced legal practitioners. But once somebody starts stamping their feet because they need something now and they're going to go somewhere else and they're going to potentially find someone else to do the work, that's the pressure that's being brought. And then the first thing where the crack shows is, are we getting the right information? Do we know these people? Do we know where these funds are coming from? And it's becoming a very changeable picture now. As Rachael was saying, we are very used to dealing with corporate structures. Another thing I always said was, well, it's not complicated. It's just a couple of companies and a trust. It's absolutely fine. Standard legal work. Now we're seeing a lot more in the cash intensive industries even. So, people with restaurants, hotels, salons. We're not seeing so much crypto at the moment yet. Probably a sectoral projection. But it will come and we will have to be ready for that. So it just means that everything is getting more complicated. And in turn, we have to be prepared to react and become, I suppose, ready to be more rigorous in our compliance.
Excellent. No, thank you. So I promised we were going to bring in a Slido word cloud, and that kind of final bit that you ended on, being more rigorous in our compliance, is probably a good starting point. So the word cloud question that we're going to ask you is, how do you feel the culture is around compliance in the Isle of Man? So please log on to Slido and start to put the single word in, and we will reveal it later on. Hopefully. Tech enabled. Noémi, turning back to you. So you mentioned your previous life in banking and when you were last here in 2010. The island is obviously a mature financial centre, and therefore risk understanding here may differ compared to other places in the world that you've worked. How would you reflect on the position that you see it in the Isle of Man, and what is there that the Isle of Man and institutions should still be wary of?
Okay, so I think it's, we always see the world through our own lens, right? And what I see a lot of is transnational organized crime, proliferation finance, and the abuse of the crypto ecosystem. So my question, and obviously I'm not, it's quite a tough question to answer when you're surrounded by, Isle of Man specialists. But my question is the following, and I think actually, Rachel, I think I could steal your answer. But my question is actually the following: how are each of those relevant to the Isle of Man? How is transnational organized crime relevant to your jurisdiction? How could you be exposed to it? How relevant is proliferation finance to your jurisdiction? How could you, through your businesses, through what, your dealings, your day-to-day dealings, be exposed to it? And similar to the crypto ecosystem, what does it mean for your jurisdiction and what does it mean for your businesses? And I was really interested actually in your answer, because what you said is spot on. So really there is this need to, we need to sort of upskill in our awareness of the crypto ecosystem, of having to look at a wallet address, of having to, if you have the resources, having access to blockchain analytics tools, knowing who to talk to in the FIU or in law enforcement to help you unpack that, and really understanding how what we call the off-chain data, your KYC, your SARS, how can that help you? And also, how could that help the wider ecosystem, the integrity of the island? Because when it comes to an investigation, when it comes to asset seizure, how can a financial institution, how can you, for instance, help with that by providing all the relevant data? So I think those are all the elements that we need to start looking at, and I think that the Isle of Man should sort of consider.
Sure. And that's really useful, because actually there's a recommended action in the Jersey Mutual evaluation which talks about the proceeds of crime from transnational organised crime. Now, leaving aside the bits that we've talked about today in publicised matters, one of the points that was made is that, well, the financial flows that go through the financial centre are so large that there must be some exposure in there. How do you know you've done everything to identify it? Which, of course, isn't the FATF standard. But it does bring us to the issue of risk assessment and continuously being vigilant about it, which nicely brings us on to Ashley. So last year and this year, we know the authority has been working at pace and with all the data that's been given by the industry on a significant number of sectoral risk assessments, and for several DNFBPs, but notably there'll be a specific detailed assessment on the TCSP sector. Compared to the last Isle of Man NRA, how will that differ, and are we expecting any significant changes for the sector?
Yeah, thanks, George. I can talk a little bit to that. As you mentioned, we are still in the drafting phase, so I'm not launching any kind of key headline or spoiler alerts today, but I think what has been really useful actually is listening to what Rachel and Lesley have said as well. Just, from what they both said before, we can see there are changes sectorally. There are sectoral changes. There are also threat changes that are affecting the Isle of Man. That has been touched on quite a lot today. When I think in most sessions, most of kind of the sessions of the local speakers, we've all spoken about the National Risk Appetite Statement. That has been really critical for us as a jurisdiction. And the development of the new NRA will lead to an all-encompassing National Risk Appetite Statement. The one we've recently published is more focused on risks in e-gaming, although I will emphasise that it applies to everybody in this room, because there is a call to action in there to have a look at your client risk, your business risk assessment, all of that. But I think a really good outcome of the National Risk Assessment is going to be that all-encompassing Risk Appetite Statement. I see that as a real positive for us as a jurisdiction, because it really puts out there what our doors are open to, but also conversely what we're not open to as a jurisdiction. And I think it's really positive to have that written down, to have that published. And I think from a business perspective, all the businesses in this room have to have a business risk assessment as per the AML-CFT code, and putting out there our national risk assessment and our National Risk Appetite Statement that helps you feed into your business risk assessments and your own risk appetite statements. What countries or sectors you are willing and not willing to take on. So I think, I'm not sure I've actually answered your question, George, because I've just got on a tangent about national risk appetite statements. But...
No, I think one of the big points is you are moving from risk understanding to actually saying at a national level what the risk appetite is. So that's really important. And the idea is that it forms a unified view across the industry of what the island is up for and what they're not. And that's a useful thing, I think, for moving forward. Yeah. But go on, please.
Sorry, I just wanted to add something else about collaboration as well.
Of course.
I just wanted to add that as we do this national risk assessment work, the collaboration is absolutely vital. And we've had some really, really engaging, really great workshops. Actually, Rachael and Lesley have been part of those workshops for their sectors. And we can't do the national risk assessment work without the engagement and the collaboration of industry. And I think we've had some really positive meetings, and actually we've had really open meetings about, what is being seen within industry, what we're seeing as a supervisor. And that is allowing us, combined with the data, which, is excellent, the data that we've got, all of that is informing a really robust national risk assessment, where actually when we come to present that at our evaluation and when we come to publish that, having been directly involved in it, we feel really comfortable that we've got the evidence, we've got the basis, we can really demonstrate effectiveness of that NRA, and we can talk to that and we can talk to the findings. And as we move forward, the engagement with us and industry and the outreach we're going to do on that NRA is going to be critical, so that actually everybody in this room has a really good understanding of what risks we face as a jurisdiction. And you can talk to it at a national level, you can talk to it at a sectoral level, so that we're all ready to talk to it and stand behind it.
Now, in that answer, you mentioned the word data, which I can't let you get away from. Now, data, I think in every country is a sensitive issue, but can you give us an idea of what the industry should expect for data going forward? My view from countries around the world is usually it's certainty and predictability that industry want for the future. Can you outline how that data collection exercise will evolve going forward?
Yeah, I'll do my best, George. I agree with you. Data is really challenging, and we do appreciate that from a firm perspective. We know it's difficult. I mentioned before, we have such varying businesses in our cohort as well, varying sizes, varying complexity. And I know some of those data points can be quite difficult. So we do sympathise, but I hope I've already sort of talked to the fact, and we heard in Liam's presentation and other presentations today, data is the crux really of how we demonstrate how well we're doing as a jurisdiction. What I can say is we are quite advanced in the NRA work now, and we have done some data requests during that work. We've done some quite discrete pieces of data requests. Again, I can only thank firms because, firms have engaged with us and it's been excellent. And we can't say exactly what data requests might be coming, but what I can commit to is that we will be, fully transparent when we do know something's coming. We will be engaging with you. We'll engage professional bodies. We're completely open to questions as well. We're open to discussions. Recently, we've had some really good workshops with the TCSP sector on the back of the legal persons and arrangements data requests that we did. And I know that was a challenging piece of work, but I hope that through the workshops, industry can see some of the really good benefits we're getting from the data. And actually, just to touch on that, a further thing I want to commit to is that we will be giving more feedback on the data. So we have been already through some of our sectoral, thematic reports that we've done. But one thing we are going to be doing, probably on the conclusion of the NRA work, as well as the publication of all of the NRA, we'll be looking at our sector-specific guidance on the back of that. And also, some of you may have seen on our website, we've got sector reports. What they are, they're not a risk assessment. They're just a report to industry on the data that we've collected from the annual returns. And it just helps you to see maybe where you sit alongside your peers. You can use it to inform your BRA, your business risk assessment. holding my hands up, we have fallen behind with the publication of those, just because we've moved on to the strict system. We've been doing a lot of national risk assessment work, but we're going to be relaunching those sector reports, which I hope firms will find useful. So I think I can't say exactly what's coming down the track, but we will be letting people know as early as we can. We're open to have discussions on it. We'll hold workshops. We'll give feedback. I think that's the best that I can kind of offer for now. And just a caveat, and George, you'll know this from Jersey, we could get a data request from the assessors during the on-site. And all I can ask is that people engage with us on that, because we maybe haven't known it's coming, and we just have to pull together and collaborate on that.
Correct. Yeah. And I think openness, transparency, and as much notice as is possible in the circumstances has to be the way forward. Now, I want to move to talk briefly to Rachel and Lesley about training, because I think training of staff is really, really important and critical to the question that you should all be putting your Slido word in on compliance culture. So Rachel, no, actually we'll go with Lesley first on this one, if that's okay. Can I ask you a bit on the importance of training in your firm and in the sector? Do you think that the Isle of Man is building an effective culture of compliance by training?
Yes, you can ask. I think to start on a firm level, we have always been very proactive with internal training. The Law Society, who are our delegated supervisor for the purposes of this, also assist greatly with release of training so that it's made available to everybody. You can have it for qualified and unqualified staff. So we choose to put every member of staff through that training as a minimum. Then we roll through my compliance manager a very reactive training program internally. So when any changes are needed, we've just gone through a cycle of updating everything. As we update, we do training internally all the time. We are very, very focused on trying to remove the multi-choice tick box training, because I feel it feeds into that tick box attitude to compliance. And it's hard when you're rolling out a training program that asks somebody 50 questions that are A, B, C, or D, or move the matter into the box. We have been very focused on trying to give real world training scenarios, things that we are seeing. The online training is now moving a little bit more, I think, into that perspective. And that has definitely given a shift in terms of how people are viewing it. We are trying to, I think the legal sector is possibly even more difficult than others in this, trying to give a very compliance first focus in certain areas. I mean, some of our business is split, so some is not regulated and some is regulated. But obviously the overarching fact of all of that is criminal proceeds and where is the money coming from. So everybody has to be vigilant about that, but it's kind of trying to say this should be a priority and not something that's done after the event. That's how we're trying to change the culture of the firm particularly. And I think the sector, although the Law Society possibly have a bit of an uphill task with the more traditional and smaller firms, because again, it is resourcing. It's okay when you have the resources available to say that, but it's definitely changing it. We're trying to embed it into everybody's minds that this needs to be done first. I'm always telling people that it's much easier when we had the slides before about the awkwardness of asking the information of the art dealer. It's the same if you've started your relationship and you haven't asked the questions at the outset. Absolutely, the client can be upset that you're asking them 4 weeks later. It's something that we're trying to bring further and further forward. And I do think that we do now have a more proactive compliance culture than we ever had before. We certainly have areas where we are still playing catch up, but it is much, much more proactive than it was. And I was only thinking, as an aside during today, I think part of the difficulty has been, and I've never really thought about it before, but collaboration isn't a very lawyerly thing. So we don't really start out being collaborative in our approach. We're very protective about our clients. We're very protective about our legal privilege, our confidentiality. So as a sector, I think we've had to do an awful lot more work to break those barriers.
Thank you. That I think is a great description of lawyers being one myself. I think on that one as well. Rachel, can I ask from your perspective from the TCSP world as well, whether there's a difference or other views?
Sure. I think from the TCSP side of things, training is something I feel really passionate about, and I think it goes hand in hand with all things good culture. And it's such a benefit, or it can be such a benefit for our firms, whether that's TCSP or not. Obviously we have to do our annual mandatory AML because that's what the code says. And we do that and it has its place and it's really important. But there's so much more that we can be delivering to our staff, and all staff, not just those that are key staff or relevant staff. And as Lesley said as well, we've got to be reactive, we've got to be agile. The trading schedule can be set at the start of the year with good intentions. We're going to hit all of those key points, but you've got to be able to say, right, something's happened with the Isle of Man, something's happened with industry, something's happened in our business. Let's pull something together and let's get it delivered. And I think it's really important to make sure that training is something that's tangible to our teams as well, using some case studies that make it feel like real world. They can relate to it, because at the end of the day, we don't just want to be stood up in front of the class and telling them that they've got to do this and follow this procedure or they're going to be in trouble. And, we'll send Ashley from the regulator down to get them if they get it wrong. It's about giving them the skill and the toolkit to be able to protect our businesses and develop our businesses. But feeding into the culture point, it's about arming staff, regardless of what level they're at, to know how to and to want to do the right thing when no one's looking or telling them to do it. And I think that is what brings, good training and good culture together.
Thank you. Much appreciated. I'm now going to move to, before coming to Noémi, to reflect on this from the work you've done with DNFBPs elsewhere. I'm going to do the great reveal of what comes up on the word cloud. So hopefully the technology is going to now tell us.
I'm a bit nervous, George, about this.
What everyone feels around the culture of compliance in the Isle of Man. So any second now, I'm hoping that the screen magically appears and this comes up. But while we're waiting for it, Noémi, maybe you can reflect on what you find in terms of challenges around culture of compliance globally.
Of course. I'm distracted now. I'm like, what's going to appear behind me? Okay. Right. I'll answer that question.
Please.
Okay. So I think, again, that's my experience from the different jurisdictions where I've been operating, providing technical assistance, supporting, the private sector. A number of DNFBPs, should I continue?
Please continue, and then we'll reflect on some of this.
Okay. Obviously remain either unregulated, or under-regulated. And of course, with that comes the fact that you have supervisors are more or less mature. So this is a lot of what I'm seeing. I think there's also the fact that DNFBPs traditionally have not been hit by fines and by, of course, there's Mossack Fonseca, but they have not been hit by fines and scandals the way financial institutions have, right? So that's a big element, a big factor as well. Again, you've mentioned the fact that a number of DNFBPs are under-resourced, so you end up being the jack of all trade. How can you be the HR director, operations director, the MLRO, as well as trying to do business development? That is an issue. So all of those elements feed into the fact that the culture of DNFBPs varies massively across different jurisdictions.
Which leads me brilliantly to invite you all to turn around and see what the conclusion of this was. I am not in any way surprised that the main word that's come up is challenging. I think globally, challenging is the phrase around DNFBP compliance. They are very varied. There's a huge number of different sectors being regulated. It is a challenging thing to do. But inside this, we've got some other very interesting words. We're seeing improving, mixed, strong, evolving. We're also seeing on the other side defensive or reactive. We've seen on some parts that people are believing it's mature, advanced. So we've got quite a differing views. I just would invite anyone on the panel if they'd like to reflect on what we've come up there. Ashley?
Yep, I will. I think, there's some really varied words on there. I think one thing I will pick up on, and it comes to some of the points that have already been raised by the panel, is I'd really just encourage businesses in the room to really speak up, with the struggles, with what is challenging. We say, we do say this at a lot of events we speak at. You can come and see us. You can talk to us about where the challenges are. We really are trying to do outreach at the moment, but not just, we want the outreach to be informed by, where are the struggles, where are the challenges, and I really want to encourage people to engage with the outreach we do. We're trying to look at different ways of engaging, whether it's through events, webinars, thematic reports. There's talk of us doing some sort of podcast, which I'm sure will be super exciting if we get to that. But we're trying to think of different methods, different things to cover. So I think that's one of the messages really that I want to give today is to engage with us, is to discuss the challenges with us. And I've mentioned our guidance a couple of times as well. Our guidance is a living document. We have the main AML safety handbook, but we have all the sector-specific guidance as well. We are absolutely open to be working with the professional bodies, with firms on all of that guidance. If firms want to provide us with examples, with difficulties, with maybe different case studies that have been mentioned, we can incorporate all of that, into our guidance and do our sector guidance collaboratively with the industry to help address some of the challenges, and specifically on challenges of compliance. The FSA has hosted a couple of sessions at the museum, specifically focusing on challenges in compliance, and they're available on our website as well. And maybe actually after this event, we might sort of push those out again. But yeah, really interesting. Yeah. I'm glad it worked. So.
And I think this is an entirely usual scenario. Noémi and I sat on an event in the UAE where we had a similar, and was it 40,000 DNFBPs or more? Yeah. And they had come into regulation within 2 years or so. And the speed of which different firms were coming up the curve was very different. It's an entirely normal position to be in.
But even look at VASPs as well. I want to say, think about the culture of VASPs 2 years ago versus where we're at now.
Completely.
I'm not saying that we've solved that, but it's a completely different landscape.
Entirely. And I think it's always an evolution point. And it comes back to the point we've been making throughout the day, which it's about dialogue and evolution of the whole regime on both sides. Now, I want to take some questions, if that's possible, from the audience on the question side of Slido. So hopefully some of those are going to miraculously appear on the screen as we speak. I'm hoping that they're going to appear. Yes, we have some. So we've got a few here. They've not yet been voted on yet, but I'm going to try and pick them out directly. So let's start with Ashley. I think I'm going to come to you first because it's on crypto, and it's how is the regulator countering the new and fast-paced AML CFT risks that are inherent in the crypto industry?
Yeah, it's interesting because we did, as the regulator, we did see quite a sort of increase in crypto applications, probably sort of 2018, 2019. I would say that's dropped off a bit in the Alabama, just for a bit of background, really. So I think we've got under 20 VASPs, but in terms of the supervisor sort of becoming versed in that area, it's an area that we are very cognizant of. We're putting our staff through training on crypto. We've also got a member of my team who sits on a Moneyval working group, which is looking at a VASP document and the application of VASP standards across Moneyval countries. So that's really positive that we're getting involved in that.
And do you expect to be putting more out or with other agencies on crypto as things evolve in the future? Will guidance be being updated or topologies, etc., with the FIU?
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned, we've got a sector guidance document for virtual asset service providers. Again, that is a living document. We have done a lot of engagement with the virtual asset service provider sector. We've actually got some of them joining us here tomorrow, where we're sort of starting work on their sectoral risk assessment with them with some workshops. So that's really positive. And we have a small working group with the VASP sector as well, where we look at any changes we're going to bring in for legislation. So when we brought in the travel rule, which was last year, we worked really closely with our VASP working group before we brought that in. Very shortly, we're going to be launching a consultation. It's going to be a bit more of a targeted consultation to our VASP sector, but we're going to be bringing in, we're going to be looking at civil penalties for that travel rule code. But again, it's just another example of that we're bringing that in, but we're working with the sector on that and speaking to them about what will work pragmatically for them as a VASP.
Okay.
And actually, we brought the travel rule in last year, and we've identified there's an area that is difficult to comply with, and we've gone a little bit different than the UK, and actually we're taking a step back, speaking to the industry and saying, right, how can we change this? How can we make this workable while still being in line with the international standards? Sure. So we're doing a lot of collaborative work with the VASP sector, and then in-house we're building our skill set in that area as well.
And this is also should be accompanied by, because I know as part of the national risk assessment exercise, there's going to be a broader look at virtual assets and its exposure to the whole sector. Hopefully this will also allow people in the more traditional finance sectors to consider how virtual assets might be exposed.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't really mention that earlier, but as part of our national risk assessment, in this new NRA, we are doing, I think somebody did mention this morning, we're doing what's called the bottom-up approach, where we're doing a number of sectoral and topical risk assessments that feed into our overarching NRA. And yeah, you're right, George, we're going to be doing a virtual asset risk assessment for the Isle of Man and a virtual asset service provider risk assessment for the Isle of Man. So both areas will be looked at. And the VASP sector is one of those sectors where we're doing a more in-depth risk assessment because it did come out as one of our higher risk sectors in our previous NRA. So it's having a bit more focus.
Excellent. Now, I'm very conscious of the time, and I want to get time in for two more questions. So I'm going to pick on one question that despite being the moderator, I can't resist kind of making a view on, which is around civil penalties for individuals, because it's very sensitive in most jurisdictions, but was certainly sensitive in Jersey and Guernsey as well. The question that's there is, in light of the recent consultation on amendment bills, which included civil penalties on individuals, how does the authority see it as being fair and proportionate? Now, before passing it to Ashley, I would like to say that still the importance of applying penalties or proportionate and dissuasive penalties against both individuals and firms is a core part of the FATF standards. Around the table in FATF or Moneyval, there is a varying view of jurisdictions, but there is certainly a view that unless there is personal culpability, that a jurisdiction will never, in some countries' minds, be able to demonstrate that the sanctions are suitably dissuasive. Now, both the other Crown dependencies and I think most of the overseas territories have introduced these provisions. So they're common kind of around the world. They obviously have to come with significant safeguards because of the issues in human rights generally around finding individuals, but they are common. And I think when you look at jurisdictions who have been, for example, recently implementing some very big penalties, in the UAE, you've seen penalties of well over kind of $50-60 million, but they're not naming the firms or finding individuals. And you see a number of high-profile commentators saying the regime still cannot be dissuasive until individuals are actually fined. So this becomes a global issue. So taking all that in mind, if these changes are made, Ashley, how will firms be able to be sure that the authority will use these in a fair and proportionate way?
Yeah, thanks, George. That additional background was really useful as well. There's probably, I can't really go into too much detail on this today because the consultation, which closed on Monday, that was really to give us the sort of the power. It was to update our regulatory framework to have the power to fine individuals as an option in our sort of supervisor toolkit. In terms of mapping out exactly how that looks, that will come in time because that would be in secondary legislation. And that would go through consultation processes with industry. So there will be more to come on that as we map out that regime. The other point I do think is useful just to make on that is that I mentioned this was in our regulatory framework. You know, this is wider than AML-CFT, civil penalties on individuals. It is part of our regulatory toolkit. It's not just about sort of AML-CFT failings. It's wider than that. And I think it's picking up on George's point. Many jurisdictions are much further ahead than we are on this point. And I think it's really critical that we do move forward with this. But I just wanted to say that we will be engaging, we will be consulting with industry at the appropriate time with more detail. But the consultation, it did only close on Monday. So, I haven't seen the results of that consultation yet. And we, as the authority, we're still working through that, but we'll be giving feedback on the consultation that closed as well.
Excellent.
If I could just jump in on that
Please.
bit while I've got the opportunity,
No
with an
worries.
industry hat on and a microphone. I just think, leading on from what you just said, Ashley, that additional consultation process is going to be obviously so important. You know, we as a community within compliance financial services have hopefully all well responded to that first consultation. But I think for us, we're going, you know, our minds are heading to what does this mean in terms of recruitment when it's already challenging, you know, to get people to come into our businesses, and, you know, the cost of that from a budgeting standpoint. What does it mean for insurance as well? You know, how much runoff are we going to have if we, you know, move into another role, etc. So I think industry will very much welcome the second consultation process.
Thank you. And I think it's critical as well. It's this ongoing conversation that has to happen. I don't want to leave the conversation without coming to proliferation financing, because Noémi, they've asked you a question there, which what makes the DNFBPs particularly at risk at PF, and would you extend that to Isle of Man DNFBPs?
Sorry, I don't think I'll answer the second part because I know you are in the process of doing your PF risk assessment. So I will, however, answer the first part. But if anyone wants to jump in for the PFN, by all means. So in terms of what makes the DNFBPs particularly vulnerable, what I would say, you know, the short answer is the same way DNFBPs are vulnerable to money laundering. You know, I really, and that's one of the key challenges. We're talking about data. We don't have right now enough data, being incredibly vulnerable here by saying that, but genuinely enough data to really help us understand what the key difference is between PF and ML. I mean, I could unpack it at a very theoretical level and have an academic conversation about that, but in terms of what the data looks like for you when you really are at the forefront of it all, that is more challenging. But really what it's about raising the revenue. So there's a case in France, for instance, of an individual who was sanctioned, who was on the UN lists, and he was designated, who was ultimately using renting his flats in Paris and raising revenue and supporting his government, because he was part of the Reconnaissance Bureau of the DPRK. And through that income, through that rental income, he was in a position to actually violate the sanctions. There's also the aspect of moving funds. So, for instance, dealers of precious metals and stones, DPMS, are vulnerable to PF through the purchase of very high-end jewelry. There's also the ability through a setup of a number of different corporate vehicles of simply obscuring the beneficial ownership, obscuring the source of funds. So really, there is an array of different ways that DNFBPs can be vulnerable to PF.
Thank you. And I think it comes back as well to that compliance culture. It's raising awareness that they can be abused ultimately and actually stopping it before it occurs. But that is because of the disparity of the sector and what goes on. I think it's just that much harder to get to. And this has all started some kind of 15 to 20 years later than we started with banks. So thank you.